Before I get into the best of the decade, the greatest music I've heard across the past 10 years, I thought it would be rude not to talk about some of the worst moments of the decade. I wasn't entirely sure whether to do this, but I did eventually come to terms with the fact that this actually would be a pretty fun video to make, and I couldn't pass up that opportunity. I was originally going to do a 50, but I thought, nah, that's going to be too much. I wanted to be a bit more concise with this and do a top 25 albums that I believe are some of the worst that I've heard across the past 10 years, and not only that, but just throughout the course of my life. It's all opinion, obviously. If you like these albums, don't be offended. It's just how I feel personally. It's all subjective, of course. I could have a completely different experience to you with an album, and that's okay. Just the same with albums I considered the best. It's all how it is. I will say as a disclaimer before this video starts that there will be some albums you would expect to see, because you may think that they're the worst, but I've either not heard them, such as the Corey Feldman album. I've actually never sat through the whole thing. Same with that Miley Cyrus album, never sat through the whole thing. Or I just actually don't hate it. I don't hate XXXTentacion 17, so it's not on here. I know a lot of people hate that, fair enough, but I personally just didn't hate it. Speeding Bullet to Heaven, didn't hate that either. Didn't really hate it, so it's not going to be on my list. It'll be on many other people's lists, but it's certainly not on mine. A few honourable mentions though before we kick into this. I thought I'd at least mention some, because like I said, I was going to extend this list, but I've chopped it down to 25, so there's a bit of room for me to bring up releases such as the Alice Glass EP, which was one of the most shrill musical experiences I can ever remember. That thing, I'm pretty sure, regularly gave me a headache whenever I tried to sit down and listen to it. Melanie Martinez's K12, which I still think Melanie Martinez is one of the strangest popular artists of the 2010s. Like, her popularity baffles me. Her entire aesthetic, her songwriting, her lyrical themes, I just think are so strange and weird, and yet you get all of her fans defending how genius she is. I'm in awe. I don't get it. Florida Georgia Line, I could mention any of their albums honestly, so I'm just going to name them just and leave their name out there because they are really one of the worst things to ever happen this decade. 6ix9ine as well, really didn't like his output this decade. I will say this though, if he had not gone to prison, he'd still be really huge, and there's a good chance even when he comes out of prison, he's still going to have hits. So beware of that, because we let Chris Brown be one of the biggest artists even after some of the things he'd done, and there's no reason why 6ix9ine wouldn't be the same as that. But here we are, the top 25, starting with the most recent album. I think that could even be a contender for this list. Liam Payne's LP1. I've got to give props to Pitchfork here because they pointed out something so damn true recently when they said that the reason why One Direction ever became a thing was because Simon Cowell rightfully pointed out that as individual singers, they weren't particularly very interesting. So he branded them all together as One Direction, and they worked really well as singers. And Simon Cowell was right, because as individuals, we got this. He's one of the most painfully awkward and dull pop singers of recent times. Like, I feel like he's really wanted to try and take Justin Timberlake's sort of area, I think, sort of territory, and start doing a bit of that R&B pop type stuff. And what we got instead was awful, cringy music about sex and awful lyrics about sex. He's just not a good performer whatsoever. This album was ridiculously long as well. It had to be on the list. I hated every second of this. This was awful. It was so bad. Next at number 24 we have an artist I don't even think is that bad, but yet he is on the list, so I guess he is pretty bad to an extent, and that is Drake with Views. This was such an angry musical experience for me. I remember being sat on the sofa and having it on my headphones and just being so frustrated that I was having to subject myself to this, but I just thought to myself, no, I'm going to have to sit through the whole thing. Again, this is another ridiculously long release, just like Drake has always done. All filler, and 1 or 2, 3 maybe great tracks has been Drake's sort of vision for the past few albums. The same happened with Scorpion. We had that there. We had it with Views, and the sort of like dance hall attempts he threw in on some of these tracks were really poor, and just how boring he is as a performer across this entire album. Like, the tracks have no life to them at all. This is just R&B at its worst. At number 23, one of the biggest fall-offs, I think, for a rapper in history of rap music, actually. Lupe Fiasco with Lasers. I'm not gonna lie, this was actually pretty funny to listen to. It was just so funny seeing him attempt these like gigantic pop crossovers with awkward as hell combinations, and like his entire his whole rapping ability on this thing was really poor as well. He was just like throwing in these random conspiracy theories at one point over some of the worst instrumentals. Like, this was the weirdest attempt at like selling out I think any rapper's ever tried, and it actually kind of worked because he got one hit from this, so I suppose that's all the power to him. At number 23, we have 93 Punks and Vic Mensa with the album that I just am so confused about as to how or why Vic Mensa decided to go in this direction. Similarly to Lupe Fiasco, this is definitely one of the weirdest and strangest detours into a different style that we may have seen from a rapper in recent times, but the only thing is with this one is that Vic Mensa hadn't really proven himself on previous releases, and so it just made this album even more embarrassing to know that this was the direction he took, like this attempt at this punk rock rap fusion that, you know, it died in the 2000s and should have never been revived like this. Goodbye racism, I guess. At number 21, we have an artist here who attempts comedy rap, and the artist that you probably were thinking as soon as I said that was Lil Dicky, but I will throw another disclaimer out and say I've never bothered to sit through a Lil Dicky album, so I'm sure he would have been on this list somewhere, but we do in fact have Awkwafina here instead to take his place. I'm sure both could have made their way onto the list if I'd heard them, but Awkwafina has a special place in my heart for being one of the least funniest comedy rappers I've ever laid my ears on. I thought sitting through Crazy Rich Asians was bad enough to see how unfunny her character was there, but listening to her rap about queefing over the most obnoxious beats you could possibly imagine kind of killed me off. At number 20, we have Imagine Dragons with Origins. Now, this is another artist where, like, for me, I've always been like, they're not that bad. Like, a lot of people have always hated Imagine Dragons. They've had so much hate. I mean, Dan Reynolds as a singer has received so much hate just for making music, like, his entire career. I mean, he gets death threats, all kinds of awful things, which he does absolutely not deserve. But strictly talking about the music, Origins was absolutely awful. Like, again, I will say that their first album, Night Visions, I didn't mind it. There's some decent tracks on there, but Origins is just, nah, I can't defend this at all. Tracks like Digital, what is that? What is that? This electronic rock fusion. I mean, if you can even say rock, it's like Muse attempting rock in the 2010s. It's like just not even rock at this point, but they'll get labeled it anyway because that's what, you know, billboards seem to do these days. But it just sounds awful. I just couldn't believe this was a mainstream artist making this. This is a mainstream artist. Like, how do they not have the ability to just make something that sounds listenable? You would think they would, but they didn't. Similarly, with mainstream artists, we have at number 19, another fall off, actually. God, this is the list of artists that keep falling off, isn't it? Eminem and Revival. One of the most ironic album titles of the decade because it is anything but a revival. Eminem here is embarrassing across the entire project with his rapping about poops and attempts at stabbing, you know, current states of politics and all that kind of stuff. Awful guest features that don't fit into the tracks whatsoever, like Kalani and Pink, Ed Sheeran as well. It was just an unbelievable album. I couldn't believe that Eminem was out here dropping an album like this, but then I suppose I had heard this before I'd heard Recovery, and you know, I guess 2010's Eminem has always been kind of going. "Aww." Eminem can rap. He really can rap. His rhyme schemes are generally quite impressive, but his punchlines and his jokes and his attempts at comedy are some of the worst. And also, his ear for music is some of the worst you may ever get from a legendary rapper. Like, he raps over some of the worst beats he could ever pick. He does not know how to pick a beat that fits his voice at all, and Revival proved that. At number 18, the Ready set, I'm Alive, I'm Dreaming. I blame Ricky for this one, because he said this was awful. I listened to it, and it was some of the worst pop music I'd heard in the 2010s. So thank you, Rick. That is not one of your best moments. At number 17 now, we have Fall Out Boy with Mania. Some of the worst attempts at like electro pop, and you know, even dubstep elements were thrown into this album. It is quite embarrassing to see where Fall Out Boy have taken their sound so far into their career. It's like they took all the worst elements of pop music and amplified them about 3 or 4 years too late. It's crazy that they thought that this was a great way to make an album in 2018. Like, this should have been like 2011, maybe even earlier than the years I just said there. Like, Jesus Christ, what were they doing here? At least Panic at the Disco make listenable music now. They may not be very good. I don't think Panic at Disco are very good, but they make listenable music. Fall Out Boy struggle to do that. At 16, we have Naff with Reckless, just one of the most boring releases you have to ever sit through. Naff is just painfully boring, honestly. Like, it's impressive how little he offers to music, like his voice, his style. Like, he's just nothing. He's nothingness in the form of music. It's impressive. I don't know how he does it. At number 15, one of the worst rock albums I heard across the decade, and that was a band that I actually liked. I even saw them live once, but I cannot defend Technology by Don Broco. This is seriously, severely awful. I don't know what they were thinking on this album, man, but like, they just threw in the worst riffs randomly. Every random point, the vocalist was just throwing in random screams as well, like on Come Out to LA. It's laughable listening to this album. They were good when they first started. They have some good tunes. Listen to their debut album, Priorities. You'll find some good tracks on there, some good pop rock tracks, but their attempt at going a bit heavier just fell flat on its face. Madonna at number 14 with Madam X. God, the lyrics on this. God. The attempts as well, like doing like the Latin pop stuff with the guest features. Oh, Jesus. What was Madonna doing? Like, she was a pioneer. She was once a pioneer. She was making some of the best pop music ever, but now she's just making some of the worst. Why? How does she do this? Gnash at number 13 with the album We. This was definitely the worst album I heard throughout the course of 2019. Jesus Christ, talk about no personality. This is like up there with Naff, with lyrics that are literally just like Tumblr-esque 14-year-old posts that Gnash even tries to rap on this as well. It's just so painful. God, what were you doing? Falling in Reverse next with Coming Home. I don't know what it is about this band and Roddy Radka, but it just brings out like the most painful memories of like my teenage years, thinking about how I used to listen to shit like this, the most like blatantly annoying emo lyrics that are just so whiny. And thinking about that, I used to like that type of stuff, just brings out this horrible feeling. And Falling in Reverse do everything they possibly can to remind me of those times. And they just make shit music as well, to be honest. At number 11, though, we have Black Veil Brides, We Stitch These Wounds. This has got to be the worst rock band singer ever. I forgot his name. It's some Andy Biersick or something like that, but I think it's called Andy. This man is one of the worst rock singers, I think, of the 2010s. Hearing his voice is so like the instrumentals are pretty terrible. Like, I feel like there's just an awful recording quality to this album. Like, the production sounds so limp and like compressed, but then you've got his voice singing over it, And that's absolutely what makes it for me. Like hearing this guy sing, he's just, he can't hit a note. He just can't hit a note. He's like, at number 10 now, the worst of the worst, the top 10 worst of the decade. We have Kim.com with Good Times. This guy was like some kind of online activist in New Zealand, and I think he started his own political party as well. And I think in like promotion of that or something bizarrely, he created this album, Good Times, and it's like, you know, just the most generic, like the most blatantly stereotypical EDM album I think you'll ever hear. It starts off fairly alright, like the first few tracks are listenable, but then as it goes on, like the beats and the synths just get way more annoying and in your face, and like it's like the guy just heard some music in the 2000s, like some club dance type stuff, and just copied that into this album because he didn't know how else to make an album, so he just used the most like generic ones he could possibly find. Like, oh god, it is by far one of the worst DJ sets you will ever lay your ears on, and yeah, it's awful. At number 9, I did throw a bit of a curveball at the beginning of the video when I said 17 by XXXTentacion won't make the list, but the posthumous album, which literally should not exist and was only there to just make some money, Skins, is absolutely making this list. Not only like the reasons for this album existing awful as they are, but the music is just wow. Like they literally just picked some snippets that X recorded and like pushed them together wherever they could fit them to just turn them into songs. And then you got a random Kanye feature on there too. Like, I just cannot believe the people involved in this album thought it was worthwhile to put this out there. It is one of the worst albums of the decade because it just isn't even an album. It's just an insult to music. Nothing is finished here. There is no finished product. The songs that aren't finished. The artist, whether, you know, like morally, yes, he was a bad person, all that kind of stuff, that doesn't matter because he wasn't even here to finish the music that they put out for him. That's just awful. It's really, really shit that they did this, and it sounds crap too. It sounds crap. God, why is this a thing? They put a second one out in 2019 as well. They did it again. I didn't even listen to that one because I just thought, no, I'm not doing this. I'm not fucking doing this because they don't deserve the listen. They don't deserve it. Awful shit, man. This is just the worst. I don't even like his music to begin with, so having to sit through an album where nothing is finished just amplifies all of the worst elements of his singing, his awful screaming, all that kind of stuff. Nah, fuck this. Now though, at number 8, we have Steven Tyler's attempt at awful singing on a country album here. I don't know what to say about this other than the fact that listening to him sing is just the worst thing. Some of the tracks are pretty inoffensive in terms of like the musical components and the structures of the songs themselves, but like hearing him sing these songs, that's enough for me to put it this high on the list. Like he has one of the worst voices I think in music history, to be honest. Even like when Aerosmith were at their peak, I still think he was a bad singer. So hearing him over these instrumentals, these acoustic, folky type instrumentals with a country swang to them, country twang should I say, sorry, yeah, it makes it even worse. 21st Century Liability from Youngblood at number 7. This guy is awful. Like the way he just glorifies like the mental illness aspect of his music is kind of grotesque, let's be honest. But the fact that his lyrics are so painfully bad that you can't even take anything he's saying seriously, which is usually what makes this kind of thing worse, because there could be like people that have serious problems, but this guy's just kind of turning it into a bit of a joke with the way he turns it into his music, and his fucking voice is the worst. Listening to his voice is like listening to Alex Turner, who went through a friggin' emo phase. Like, I don't want to hear that, man. Blood on the Dance Floor at number 6 with All the Rage. I don't even know if I even need to explain myself here. Blood on the Dance Floor just explain themselves when you have to sit through their music. What the hell are they doing with this, man? It's just unbelievable. These terrible trance elements mixed in with like the screamo, it's like the worst genre combination you can ever conjure up. Like 2010s was a decade where we loved to kind of blend genres together even when it didn't make sense, and Blood on the Dance Floor are pretty much the prototype band for that. I'm of the age range as well where like when they were kind of getting quite popular, they appealed to people my age. So I had friends who played this music, and even then at school, I hated this shit. And listening to them years later to see how they've aged, I'm pretty sure those people that I was friends with regret ever listening to this, because what the hell were they thinking? And number 5, perhaps one of the biggest names to have such an album so high up on the list here, and that is Childish Gambino. But this is in fact a mixtape, and it is Camp. Keep in mind that I think Awaken My Love is a really good album, by the way. I don't particularly care for Because the Internet all that much, but I think it's pretty safe to say that Gambino fans recognise that Camp was a bit awful. I'm still of the opinion that some of his lines that he throws out there are just like jokes, like he's really not taking it seriously. I remember doing a listening party actually with my boy Josh when we played this, and I was even saying then, like, these have got to be jokes, like he's not taking this seriously. But then I realised that it doesn't matter if it's serious or it's a joke, they're still terrible lines. Like, it's like Awkwafina, like, yeah, she's making a joke out of her music, but it's not funny. So if this is a joke, it's not funny, but if it's serious, then it's still awful because the lines are shit. Again, it's another attempt at combining styles as well, where you've got Heartbeats on here, which has this awful friggin' dance instrumental that barges its way in where it doesn't belong. God, this album, man, it's hilarious. It's actually one of the funniest albums on the whole list just because of how embarrassing it is to listen to. On the opposite end of the scale to someone like Gambino, we have an artist that really isn't very well known at all at number 4, and that is Joan of Arc with He's Got the Whole Land, This Land Is in Your Hands. He's got the whole This Land Is Your Land in his hands, or something like that. I don't even know. Just a really poor attempt at like some experimental rock music. This is just like experimental music gone wrong, because tracks like this Must Be the Placenta have awful instrumentals. The vocalists across this album just have no life to them. The whole way through they're both just like it's just the worst. It just sucks life out of you listening to this. And I think these some of the members were involved in the band Cap and Jazz, which were never really that bad in the 90s, but 20 years later, yeah, it's not good. At number 3, Lil Zan with Total Zanarchy. Total shittery, more like. This is just the worst of what you can get from the mumble rap genre, which is pretty much become a non-existent term at this point, a term that has no meaning to it whatsoever, because you usually just get like old heads, you know, traditionalists being like, this is just that mumble rap, it's destroying rap music. But to be fair, sometimes it's not that bad of a label, because this is literally the embodiment of mumble rap. I mean, Lil Zan the whole way through is just mumbling. He's like the laziest rapper I think I may have ever heard. Every track he's just like, it really just embodies the worst elements of like trap rap, cloud rap, which can be great genres at their best. But Lil Zan sucked everything out of it and turned it into this, a druggy, hazy mess with no enjoyment value, whatever, like, at all. There's just nothing to enjoy here. Maybe Moonlight, maybe, but that's like it. At number 2, we have Broken Side with We'll Never Die. Basically everything I said about Blood on the Dance Floor, but like worse. This is worse. This is all of that, but worse, somehow worse. They did it worse than Blood on the Dance Floor, and Blood on the Dance Floor was already the lowest it could possibly get, but they went lower. amazing how they did it. It's such a hideous sounding album with the auto-tune slathered all over the guy's voice, the random screams again that come out of nowhere. Oh my god, the instrumentals. You would think that this was just all a one big joke. Maybe it is, and I just fell for it all, but it still sounded bad. But now we're here, the number one worst album of the decade. Now for me to sort of explain this one, I feel like I have to go into a bit of a spiel, a bit of a preamble to sort of get into what exactly it is that makes this the worst album I've heard this decade, and probably the worst album I've ever heard. You always get debates across music lovers about separating the art and the artist. You get it in films too, actually, with directors who have questionable histories and stuff like that. And, you know, obviously, you've got to take it upon yourself to make the decision of whether or not you want to separate the art from the artist, if you feel that, you know, you can still enjoy the art while recognizing that the artist may not be a morally good person and that kind of thing. But where the issue really starts to become amplified into a bigger problem is when that seeps into the music, you know, those personal beliefs that you morally disagree with or whatever become the music. That's where you've got to draw the line, because how can you support something where the artists in the art they're making are expressing those views? And that's why for me, I cannot stand here and say objectively, honestly, that there is an album worse than this I have heard this decade, because there just cannot possibly be one. The Flat Earth Movement album from Eric Dubé is my number one pick for worst album of the decade. And honestly, if you've heard it, how can you not agree with me on this? Because listening to this is just, I'm in awe. Again, I just sort of want to think to myself, is this all one big joke like with the other albums I've mentioned, where it just all seems to be like a huge joke? But no, this guy is like a campaigner for the Flat Earth Movement Society. So across this album, he's rapping. This guy tries to rap over these awful beats and tries to tell you that the government is lying to you, the earth is actually flat. On top of that, it gets worse. This man is like a Hitler supporter, and throughout the album he tells you that Hitler was okay actually. He wasn't that bad, you know, he was alright, apparently, according to Eric Dubé. He was a pretty swell guy. And that's the fucking album. It's just conspiracy theories of this man trying to tell you that the earth is flat and that what Hitler did was actually great for the world. You just can't make this shit up. This is an album. This is music. How can anything be worse than this? There is nothing worse than this. He also lectures you about eating meat as well, so I guess if you're an avid vegan, you may support those beliefs that he shares on the album. But, you know, being told that you're a bad person for eating meat isn't really something I personally ever want to hear. But, you know, all the other things that he does on this album, I just cannot possibly ever think of a reason why you could excuse this. There's even one track where it's just literally Hitler propaganda. Like, it's not even a song, it's just snippets of, like, you know, like voiceovers or, like, things that Hitler said back in the... Oh, it's just like, what is this? Yeah, the worst album I've ever heard and the worst of the decade. The cringiest album of the decade by far. The most morally questionable album of the decade by far. This is the Flat Earth Movement album. I kind of feel bad for even bringing the name up, because now I've probably promoted it, inadvertently promoted this. So yeah, that's it. The worst albums of the decade. Let me know your worst albums of the decade in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. If you have any thoughts on the albums I brought up in this video, please let me know what you think of them. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, share it around too. Hopefully you had fun watching what I had to say. Subscribe if you haven't already. Have a good day, and goodbye.